Welcome everybody to May's webinar. It's lovely to see so many of you here again. I'm Ruthie Good, Events Coordinator for the Art Deco Society UK, as you probably know by now. And I'm looking forward to introducing Rosie Taylor from the BFI, who's going to be heading up our webinar this evening. But first of all, I'm going to run through the usual reminders. Just getting my crib list here. Okay, so firstly, for auto-generated captions during the webinar, please click on CC live transcription at the bottom of your screen and then show subtitles if you need that service. A quick reminder also that this is the Zoom webinar format, so it's not like a Zoom meeting that you might have at work, so no one can hear you at home. All right, so don't worry about making any noise or being seen. Just sit back in your pajamas on the sofa and let your dog bark. Doesn't matter, we can't hear or see you. Next, just as usual, we'll follow up tonight's presentation with a question and answer session with Rosie, our speaker. So if you have any questions for her, just type them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, or you can use the chat function to share any thoughts or comments that you might have throughout the proceedings. And I'll put all your questions to Rosie at the end. Lastly, if you have any issues with sound or video, please use the chat function also to flag these up, and we'll do our best to resolve this behind the scenes. Happily, we don't seem to have had that happening too much, so fingers crossed, all goes smoothly. So that's all the boring stuff out of the way. So I'd now like to introduce our speaker, Rosie Taylor. Rosie is a curator of fiction film at the British Film Institute, BFI. And she's currently undertaking a PhD on private film collecting of 9.5mm film at the University of Bristol. Formerly, she was a film archivist at the BFI National Archive, and she's a graduate of the L. Jeffrey Selznick School of Film Preservation in Rochester, New York, in the USA. Rosie's areas of research and expertise include contemporary British film, 1930s British film, which is what we're particularly interested in, silent westerns, private film collecting, and 9.5mm film history and preservation. Rosie's talk for us tonight is called 9.5mm, the world's first popular home movie format. Rosie will focus on the first 18 years of 9.5mm film and will include video demonstrations of some of the most interesting films and film projectors. So without further ado, I'm going to stop now and hand you over to our speaker for the evening, Rosie Taylor. Thank you. Take it away, Rosie.
Thank you, Ruthie. Hello, everybody. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to everyone at the Art Deco Society for allowing me to come and do this talk. I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. And I'll just bring up my slides myself. She said, oh, sorry. There we go. Okay, so as Ruthie said, I'm a curator at the BFI. My main area of focus actually within my job is contemporary British cinema, sort of from the 1990s to today. But as you've probably gathered, I have a number of other sort of research areas, including 9.5mm film. But I'm going to briefly start the presentation at the beginning of cinema itself. Most aspects of film, including different film formats, sound, 3D and colour were experimented with from the very start, and also in some cases before the birth of cinema in the 1890s. And bringing the movies, aka moving pictures, to the into the home was no different. As the advertising slide on the far left shows, there were lots of different early inventions for the home cinema, and some of the early home movie formats. Oh, excuse me, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat. Some of the early home movie formats included 17.5mm film, 22mm film, and also 28mm film, the latter actually enjoying popularity right into the 1930s. And just to clarify for anyone who's not aware of this, the measurements for film, we measure film from across the width from the outside edge to the outside edge. And the width of professional film for production and projection in the cinema was standardized in the mid-1920s at 35mm film, which lasted really up until the coming of digital about 15 years ago, albeit in a variety of different developments within that, and you know, notwithstanding things like 70mm and IMAX, etc., etc. The issue for home movie film in the early years was that standard motion picture film at the time used cellulose nitrate as the plastic base on which the photographic image was printed. This material was, and still is, highly flammable, producing toxic fumes and its own oxygen, which makes nitrate fires incredibly challenging to put out and also very dangerous. Nitrate was phased out of professional filmmaking in the early 1950s, but in the early days of cinema, as a result of the use of nitrate as standard, the hunt for a non-flammable alternative for home movie use started very early. Acetate plastic was the first alternative, and what all home movie formats would be made of going forwards, bar some of the early experiments and some weird amateur knockoffs, which is an entirely different presentation on its own. But these are actually very, very rare. Flammable materials aside, one of the biggest issues with early attempts at home movie formats was that they were expensive and the equipment was large and heavy and not easy to use or to carry around. The French company Pathé, who had been very active in professional film manufacturing, productions, and distribution, made several early attempts at home movie film. Although they hadn't invented 17.5mm film, they did try to revive it, but with very little success. 28mm was their more successful but still expensive attempt. They wanted to find a way to make home movies affordable to average Joe, and they succeeded with 9.5mm film. Its width was one of the key things that made it more affordable for the public. Pathé could make 3 rolls of 9.5mm film from 1 roll of 35mm film, as I said, the standard cinema width of film at the time. So the top left diagram in the article on the slide shows a 35mm piece of film, and below it you can see that there's 3 lines of images on the ones below, and that's the 9.5mm film that they printed onto this. So this saved them money because they could get basically 3 for the price of 1. They could also largely use all their existing manufacturing equipment with a few modifications, including slitting the film in 3, as you can see just from the diagrams in that article on the left, meaning they didn't have to spend a lot of money making very much new equipment. This made it cheaper to produce and obviously therefore cheaper for the customer. Perhaps the most defining feature of 9.5, though not original to it, was the centre perforation hole. All other formats of film, with the exception of some early experiments, have their perforation holes down one or both sides of the films. This centre perforation was key to cutting costs, as it was this that allowed Pathé to put the 3 strips, to make 3 strips of 9.5 from a 35mm film. Incidentally, the image area size of 9.5 is approximately the same size as the image area of the 16mm film. 16mm film is 16mm wide because it has its perforations down the side, so it's got added extra film on the edges, essentially. This is significant as the quality of film, the film image is often judged by its width, or the width of the film. It's generally assumed that the wider the film, the bigger the image area, and essentially, without getting too technical about it, the more detail can be captured on the image. The image area of 9.5 is often misunderstood as a result of this, because actually it's narrow. The film's narrower than 16mm, but the image goes right up to the edges of the film itself. So 9.5 was launched by Pathé in 1922, reaching Britain in 1923. It was very popular in Europe, but it did have a worldwide market. It was less popular in the US due to competition from Kodak's 16mm film, which was released the year after 9.5 in 1923, and also later due to World War II. And I'll come back to this towards the end of the presentation. But it was still, relatively popular in the States. And Pathé set up different arms of their home movie outfit in different countries. So the arm in America was called Pathex, and Pathé Scope was the British arm of Pathé, producing 9.5 film in this country. And it was hugely popular for home movie viewing and also for home movie making and amateur film in Britain and also, like I said, across Europe and in other parts of the world. It was primarily produced for home movie viewing, so Pathé released a lot of their own films on 9.5 from their back catalogue of films they produced for the cinema. I'll come back to the films a bit later, but another cost-cutting exercise, which, that's kind of key to this format, is the cost-cutting. Is that most of the films were cut down versions of the original cinema releases, sometimes cut down extensively. They also introduced something called notched intertitles, which to my knowledge is unique to 9.5. I won't explain the details of this now, but essentially it enabled them to shorten the film further by only needing a few frames with any of the text on for the silent films. And the projector would stop the film in the projector for the audience to read that text, whereas that's not what would happen for other formats or other gauges of film. And this could shorten the film by another few feet. Happy to explain this at the end if anyone's interested, but it's just a bit too long-winded for the presentation. So again, shorter the film, the less physical film was required per title, making it cheaper to produce and cheaper for the customer to buy. The first films were released in tiny 30-foot cassettes, and in 1926 they started releasing 60-foot cassettes. The picture on the left there shows the two different sizes next to each other. And these only ran for a matter of minutes, really, really, really short films. And of course, if you wanted to show films in your home, you needed a film projector. The first one of these was the Pathé Baby, which was a very compact little machine released in 1922, which I think ceased production in the early 1930s. There were several different versions of this projector with various modifications, which will sort of become obvious as I go through the presentation. But they largely looked the same. They just had, variations depending on developments that were made for 9.5 at the time. But the easiest way to sort of show you how this works is to actually show you a video of how to set it up. So I'm just going to, hopefully show you this video. This is one of my machines, and I'm just going to demo how it works for you. So you open the cassette case like that. You open the gate, where the film will go. This is a little cassette with the film in it. You pull the end of the film out, and you place it into the cassette holder and close the gate. So this is literally how it would have started at the very beginning of this film format. And then you thread it down into the gate into the take-up chamber, which it will show in the next shot. And then you close the gate, and that little round thing at the back, that's where the lamp is in the projector. So here we are. Then these machines were hand cranked to start with. So you crank them, and as you can see in the bottom in the chamber, the film is taking up. The film is actually attached to the inside of the cassette. So when the film is finished running, it won't come out of the cassette, it will just stop, and then you have to rewind it. So here's it going into the cassette again. Oh, sorry, going into the take-up chamber. It needed electricity for the bulb, but essentially early on you did hand crank these projectors, and later they had motors as well. So this is what it looks like coming out of the cassette. And the projection would be happening towards the yellow door. So I'm behind the projector, and where that yellow door is where the image would be showing the lenses at the front. And then when you finish, you just use take the gate, open the gate, and rewind it using the little rewind function at the top. Just to note, this projector has various modifications, including some of the handles. So it's original, but a little bit modified. And then you just take it out and close it up. So that's essentially how that works. So, okay, so back here. So this is just a bit of, these are just some illustrations of the various models of projector that you could get. Just for show, here's a couple of advertisements for the Pathé Baby. The ad on the left, I think, is somewhat deceiving. Other people may have better experiences with the Pathé Baby than me. But the bulbs in the early projectors were very dull. They weren't very high voltage. And so the image was, like I said, was very dull. And also the image projected was actually quite small. I certainly haven't managed to get either of my working Pathé Babies to project an image that bright or that big. So I feel like that the one on the left is a bit of false advertising, but if anyone else has been able to do that, then I would love to hear, because I'd like to improve my Pathé Baby's projection ability if possible. So, as I said, initially Pathé released films on 9.5 from their own back catalogue, including a lot of travel logs and nature films. Pathé were particularly famous for their stencil colour films. Again, one of the things experimented with in from the birth of cinema, really, when even pre-cinema, was colour. Films were hand coloured and later stencil coloured, and stencil colouring was something that Pathé were like I said, very well known for. And they released several 9.5 films of theirs on 9.5 with stencil colour. There's very few of them, and they are very rare. But one such title, which is the only one I've managed to collect so far, is the Tarn Gorges, which is the picture on the left there. So it was released on 9.5 in 1922, but the actual original travelogue film, I think, was from the mid to late teens, if I remember rightly, and it was one of their own productions. But they're really quite beautiful. The stencil coloured films. I'm a big fan of them. Pathé also licensed films from other companies to distribute on 9.5. So other early subjects included Felix the Cat, who I'm a really big fan of. I collect Felix the Cat on 9.5, and also Bonzo the Dog. There are a number of, I think only one film was released on 9.5 of Bonzo's in the UK. I think the rest are foreign releases of it. But yeah, there are lots of interesting subjects. Animations, I think, of the 1920s are particularly innovative. If anyone's seen any of the Out of the Inkwell animations, those are really quite something. I love watching those things. And the same, like I said, with Felix the Cat, I'm a big fan. Pathé also released their newsreels, their Pathé Gazette on 9.5. So the Pathé Gazette, I think, would play in cinemas weekly. It was sort of a weekly newsreel, and the 9.5 version was sort of like a monthly release, and it just included the highlights of the month's cinema news, basically. So it was an amalgamation of the 4 weeks that had gone before. But some of these are quite interesting and quite nice. Chaplin was also hugely popular. And a number of his films have had their titles changed for 9.5 releases. And this is another interesting aspect of 9.5, was that this was very common to have their original titles changed, particularly here in Britain. It isn't always the case, but it has happened a lot. And it's not really known why, but it's assumed that it's because perhaps the license Pathé had to distribute these films on 9/5 had lapsed, but in order to continue doing this and perhaps not pay the original production company, they changed titles and sometimes even changed the names of the characters as well, so that, I guess, so they wouldn't be caught. For example, the Adrian Brunel film A Light Woman was released on 9/5 under the title Dolores. And what is particularly interesting about that is that for many years, films previously thought lost have been masquerading under alternative titles on 9.5mm film. Perhaps the best example of this is the films by the 1920s American comedy group, the Hallroom Boys. The majority of the original 35mm copies of their films have been lost, but a number of them survive on 9/5, them much shortened from the original, and again under different titles. So not all of them have been identified, but so there may be more hiding on 9/5. But this is one of these weird quirks about this gauge that I really like. Comedy was actually particularly popular. There's lots of Our Gang and Snub Pollard and many other silent comedies available on 9/5 film. Drama was also popular. Abel Gantz's Napoleon, the 1927 film, was released on 9/5. If anybody knows Kevin Brownlow and his lifetime's work of restoring Napoleon, this actually started when he was about 15 and rented a very cut down version of it on 9/5 to view at home, and it became his life's mission to restore it from there. But again, that's a whole other presentation. Although 9/5 was, as I said, primarily for home movie viewing, Pathé did release a camera in 1923, the Pathé Baby camera, which is the one in the photo on the right. It's got Pathé Baby and their cockerel embossed on the edge. And the Pathé H camera, which is one on the photo on the left there, that's a 1930s one that they released. These were hand cranked or wind up sort of projectors. I have 3 Pathé Scope H's and a couple of them still work in theory, but getting stock for them is very difficult, and that's something I'll sort of mention a little bit later on as well. But the cameras are really nice. I'm a big fan of the little Pathé Baby one that I've got. Again, the camera gained popularity with amateur filmmakers for making amateur films and also personal home movies. As these adverts suggest, it was ideal for shooting home movies and holiday snaps. I really love the advertising of Pathé, I have to say, as I think I said before, but I think it's just a really nice era of advertising design. The one on the left is French, but the one on the right there, which is a bit, this is one of mine. It's a bit worse for wear, but this is Pathé Scope one, so this is a British advertisement. And there's a couple of really nice ones out there. There's another one that I'd really like a copy of, which is it's a woman filming somebody on a horse jumping over a hedge, and it's just a really beautiful illustration. I think they took a lot of time over these. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about working with these films in retrospect from an archivist's point of view, as sort of my formal training in this area. And I'm just going to talk about some home movies, really. This is a collection in the pictures here. This is a collection of 15 30-foot cassettes that I bought in a paper bag at a film fair from a dealer for £5. Some had labels, some did not, and there were these yellow post-its that were clearly meant to be attached to the films but had fallen off in the bag. I knew nothing about these films. The only clue was a printed email and a handwritten letter in the bag. The printed email had the name and email address of the person whose family's films these were. But the handwritten letter was from this person saying that these were his father's films. They'd been filmed in the 1930s and he didn't want them anymore. Not his father. I think his father had long passed, but this guy whose letter was in the bag, he didn't want the films, which is a shame. Although I do wonder whether he kept the best ones, because some of these are either overexposed or very underexposed. So he might have just been sort of getting rid of the not so great films, I guess. So I think one of the most enjoyable things about film archiving is identifying films. It isn't uncommon to have films that you don't know what they are, and it's particularly difficult if you're dealing with home movies, because there's usually kind of quite often, unless you've got them from a family member who shot them or knows a lot about them, they're quite difficult to decipher and identify. So just sort of a couple of points around this are that one of the key things to look for in these kind of films is women's fashion, because it changes much faster than men. If you're dealing with kind of documentary or actuality film, this is a very good way of sort of dating the film roughly, alongside cars as well, another sort of thing where design changes quite fast. Location wise, you're kind of looking for monuments and buildings and various things like that, things that are kind of iconic, I guess. And this is what this slide kind of depicts. So this was one of the films in the collection. I apologise for the darkness of the photos. This, again, it's an underexposed film, but the picture on the right is an anchor which has been turned into a monument. And so basically, I mean, luckily for me, I'm living in an age where we have Google. I don't know what archivists did prior to Google, to be honest, or prior to the internet. But I basically Googled anchor monuments and sifted through the pictures until I found one that I discovered was this particular one. And it's the HMS Victory anchor in Southsea. So I was like, okay, great. So this film, or at least part of it, was shot in Southsea. And then I came across another monument, and which is the photo on the far left. And when I looked that up, I kind of just looked up memorials in Southsea, hoping that, you know, the film was all shot in the same place. And indeed, it was a monument in Southsea. So we know that this particular film was shot in that location. There's another film that's shot in Wimbledon. I haven't gone through all these films yet, so there's more to find out. But there's also a couple in northern France. So the general location of the film so far seems to be the southeast or southwest London and northern France. So that's I'm kind of assuming that they've kind of gone on holiday to France a few times and taken a few snaps while they're away. But these are the kind of things you can look out for in it, and it's quite exciting and really quite interesting. And I think with home movies particularly, you get a real snapshot into ordinary people's everyday lives, rather than, you know, having a fictionalized account or a very I suppose focused view of something through a documentary film. These are very excuse me, very, you know, genuine everyday depictions of people's lives, and that's what I find really, really nice about them, even if you don't know who the people are in the film. So as time went on, 9.5 users were getting frustrated, not just with the shortness of the films, but also, as I sort of mentioned, the bulb in the Pathé Baby projector, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But in the late 1920s, Pathé introduced a 300-foot spool. So there's a photo of one there on the bottom left. This was the standard one, but you could get sort of other ones. So if you look at the bottom right of the right-hand photo, that's another another type of spool they released. But these 300-foot spools, instead of only having a few minutes per reel like you did with the cassettes, you could get between 12 and 15 minutes of film on one of these. The standardized length of the standardized speed of film for the cinema was 24 frames per second. That was sort of standardized again in the mid 1920s. But with 9.5, it's kind of approximately kind of 16 to 18 frames a second, if that makes sense to anybody. So that's why it's sort of like between 12 and 15 minutes per reel. And they also began to introduce running titles. So I mentioned before that they'd have notch titles where the film would stop in the projector, enabling the audience to read the film. And this would enable them to keep the film quite short. But now they started introducing intertitles like in all the other formats and like you watch them in the cinema, where the film just keeps running. And they did this partly really because, again, I think there were lots of complaints from users who were finding the whole notching system a bit tricky. You know, stopping the film in the projector and starting it again, it could be quite a tricky thing to do, and it didn't always go right. I certainly haven't mastered it. So I can't imagine what, you know, they had to deal with. Also, as the reels got longer, so did the list of titles available on 9.5. So you could get kind of longer films and I suppose in some cases better films, really. Hitchcock films, including Champagne, was available on 9.5, the original 1929 version of The Informer, and a number of the German UFA titles, UFA film productions were available, including The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and also particularly popular even today on 9.5 is the shortened 9.5 version of Metropolis, significantly shorter than the most recent restoration of this title, and yet still sells on eBay for a couple of £100. It just seems to be like a popular version of the film. So to continue to make this affordable for existing users with the developments of longer spools of film, the owner of the Pathé Baby could buy attachments for their existing projector, including spool arms, as you can see on this Pathé Baby. This meant that they didn't have to buy a whole new projector in order to enjoy these benefits. They could just buy the attachments and add them on. And you could actually buy a number of attachments for the Pathé Baby, including a colour wheel to add tinting to your film as well. And I'll talk about colouring a bit later. So this is, I think, a slightly later model of Pathé Baby than the previous one I showed you. And also this hasn't been modified as much. This is kind of more original and beyond the electrical side of things being modernized, which you have to do with these things now. As time went on, Pathé did introduce new machines. Again, like I said, the bulb in the Baby was quite dull, so people wanted a brighter picture, they wanted a bigger picture, and so different projectors came in. The one after the Baby was the Kid, which is on the illustration on the right hand side. And then also the Lux, which is also in the illustration and in the picture there. Both of these machines did cassettes, but also did spools as well. So you could attach the spools. So these were sort of some further developments of Pathé's projectors. Other companies also started manufacturing 9.5 film projectors. So Bolex made the Bolex DA. The one in the picture on the left there, that's a 1937 model, but they did have a 1932 model, I think, that came out earlier, and that's actually the preferred model, the 1932 one. The 1937 one has an inbuilt design fault, around the notching device, which is just unique to the 1937 one. I only have a 1937 one. I haven't managed to get hold of the early 1930s one. But these do notch titles. They don't do cassettes, but they do the spools, obviously. And these machines, quite a lot of the other companies made machines that were dual gauge. So they usually do 16mm film and 9.5, or they do 16mm and 8mm film. To my knowledge, there weren't any 9.5, 8mm ones. I think technically it was quite difficult to make a machine work for both those two gauges. The projector on the right there, this is a Specto. So these were designed by a Czech engineer, but they are actually British-made machines. This is the first model that ever came out in the 1930s. These are really good machines. They're still very popular today. They're very reliable. They're really gentle on the film. They're really easy to use. I actually use, not this one, but I actually do use one regularly, a Specto, a mid-1950s one for projecting my 9.5 silent films, because they're just so nice to use. But these were a very popular model, and they're still kind of around. Working 9.5 ones seem to be a bit harder to get your hands on, but generally speaking, they're really, really good machines as well. So this is just for show, really, but I'm not going to talk too much about this, but this is a Pathé Scope Gem. I've included this just because I think it's a really nice design of projector, very unusual. These are, again, 30s model. They generally came in this gold colour, but they did come on some other colours. But I just think it's just a really nicely designed machine. And the look of these machines was important. You get that in some of the magazines of the time, people talking about how attractive the machines were. It was, it was about how well they worked and how affordable they were, but also, how they looked. Just a quick look at this. You can see it's got a lovely badge, Pathé Scope Limited, and the gem. Just a really, really nice machine. This one doesn't work either. I've got a few projectors that don't work yet. They do need a bit of extra work. But yeah, just included that just for viewing pleasure, really. Oops, sorry. There we go. Colour 9.5 film also became available more from for the home movie and amateur filmmaking market than anything else. With the exception of those early Pathé stencil colour films I mentioned before, some tinted prints for home movie releases of professional films were available. But I think, my experience, although there may be other people who can have a different perspective on this, but most colour seems to be for the non-professional filmmaking market rather than for the home movie releases. So you've got systems including Buffet Color, and also Kodak started making Kodachrome 9.5 as well. So other manufacturers, as well as making projectors, there are other manufacturers also manufacturing various different types of 9.5 at times as well. Sorry for the quality of this picture. I've borrowed it from the Graham Noonan web pages. Oops. Okay. So sound has also been experimented with since the beginnings of cinema, but became a key development in cinema viewing from sort of the late 1920s. And 9.5 sound followed not long afterwards, although there were some bumps in the road. Early attempts at 9.5 sound involved sound on disc. So you can see an advertisement for the Bolex DA there with sound on disc on the left-hand side. And this this has happened in professional filmmaking experiments, which was, you had to sync the sound on a disc up to the image on a projector. And you can imagine that didn't always work very well, especially if the disc skipped or if the film stopped in the projector, and, it was a bit difficult. And these were sort of known problems, I think, really, with these kind of things. But there were early attempts at this. But sound on film already developed by the early 30s for 35mm cinema projection, followed on 9.5 in the mid to late 1930s. So you could get both magnetic and optical soundtracks, which I won't go into the details of here, but there's plenty of information available for that online. But as such, you could buy attachments for your existing projectors. So a bit like you could get, the arms for the Pathé Baby. For other projectors, you could buy a base with the amp and the necessary sound attachments for your existing silent film projectors. But also there were projectors that were designed for 9.5mm sound. One of the most popular still now is the Pathé Box, which there's an advertisement for on the right there. But I'm going to skip to the next slide just because there's a photo of one here and a clearer picture in the advertisement. The photo is actually of a 16mm Supervox, but essentially the design is the same. It's just for this one's just a 16mm. And these were very popular. There are a lot of different 9.5 projectors made of varying quality, and for sound as well. And there are a lot of the original 9.5 sound machines were not very popular, but this was one of the few original ones that was very popular, and like I said, still is today. You can get more recent projectors that have been converted to 9.5 sound. There don't appear to be very many popular original machines for this, though. But I don't know. I'm not sure I find this particular projector very attractive when we're thinking about looks, but it's definitely an interesting projector, and it's on my to buy list. I haven't got one of these as yet. So obviously new films would be available on 9.5 for sound. So as you can imagine, musicals were unsurprisingly popular releases for 9.5 sound. Oddly, a lot of the musicals had their musical numbers cut out of the 9.5 release of the film and sold separately as individual short films. I'm not quite sure why that is. I haven't done enough research into it, but it is an interesting kind of aspect of 9.5 sound. And going back to lost films on 9.5, two British films that have actually retained their original titles, but at the same time are actually only known to survive on 9.5mm film are Marry the Girl from 1935 and Charing Cross Road, both of which are now preserved in the BFI National Archive on 9.5mm film. Both these titles were made by British Lion, and a number of British Lion films from the 30s particularly were lost in a studio fire. But some titles have survived on 9.5 in private collections. So it's just quite an interesting aspect, again, of this gauge, and what we can still find on it really historically, that's of historical values. One of the weird developments of 9.5 sound film was mute films, which were essentially sound films that had been released on 9.5 as silent films. So they'd had the soundtrack wasn't with them, but they had intertitles created like you would for a silent film and just released as silent. I think this also happened with 8mm as well. But basically the film, these were not particularly popular, and they're certainly not particularly popular nowadays. I think a lot of them seem to have sold, and I think the aim was partly was that people who couldn't afford 9.5 sound could still enjoy the benefits of the sound films that were being released on their site by buying these mute films and watching them on their silent projectors. So you quite often get a sound release of a film, but then also a mute release of the same film as well, so that it catered to both markets, I suppose, and the people who could afford it and the people who couldn't. Sometimes, as was the case with Disney films, the original production companies would not allow their films to be released on home movie formats with sound. So none of Disney's sound films, as far as I'm aware, and this largely applies to things like the Silly Symphonies, none of these are available on Sound 9.5, or I think possibly on 8mm either. They're all mute films, which is frustrating in some ways, but just an interesting aspect of their history. So amateur film magazines were very popular, not just for advertising home movie formats and equipment, but for how-to guide, for amateurs to share their experiences and often argue with each other about their opposing opinions of various aspects of home movies, technical and aesthetic. This is just a couple of the Pathé catalogues. I've included these really because they've just got really beautiful covers. I think these are ones from the early 1930s. There are many debates in the Pathé Monthly Gazette and the Pathé and in other amateur magazines about around 9.5, particularly actually around the cutting down of the films, like I said, the shortening of them, and whether this was a good idea or not. It was quite a hot topic, I think, throughout the history of 9.5. And Pathé not only released, like I said, their own catalogue, but also a monthly magazine. And these kind of things would have contributions from Pathé staff, Pathé Scope staff, professional filmmakers, and amateurs alike. Amateur Cineworld was one of the most popular magazines, which gives a very in-depth insight into what home movie viewers and amateur filmmakers were interested in. I mean, this kind of covered all gauges, but 9.5 did appear a lot in it. It's got a lot of very detailed information, and again, lots of advice and guidance for home movie making and amateur filmmaking, as well as a lot of interesting advertisements and articles about using different equipment and various things. It's really, really quite fascinating. And I do love the cover of this particular magazine. I can't remember what year it is. It's 1930 something, but it's March 1930 something. I can't. Yeah, sorry, didn't include the date on that one. So you have to excuse the top picture here has probably got some language in it that's not appropriate today, just as a caveat. But this is just interesting in terms of talking about the war. So the 30s was kind of the heyday of 9.5mm film, but World War II was kind of the beginning of its demise. A number of factors contributed to this. Firstly, Pathé's main factory being based in Paris. So It was in occupied Europe. Not only this, but the factory was bombed during the war and equipment was destroyed, and also a number of the films, I believe, as well. So a lot of the original negatives that Pathé were doing printing from. The workers and experts would have largely been called up to serve, many possibly not returning after the war. And we had similar challenges in Britain, obviously, as well. And much of the resources during this time shifted to the war effort. So a lot of the companies, even manufacturing film projectors, turned to manufacturing stuff for the war. And obviously, post-war rationing kicked in. And as you can see, just looking at the enlarged sections from this Pathoscope article, talking about, the slowing down of things due to war production, and also kind of the rationing and coupons and stuff. So it did have a massive impact, really. Another major factor related to this was that Kodak, who were responsible for, as I mentioned earlier, they released 16mm and 8mm film, and they had a huge amount of investment put into the development of 16mm film during World War II, because it was a format that was used for reconnaissance work in the war. So while Pathé had to cut back and almost completely cease manufacturing and releasing 9.5 film, Kodak was having a lot of investment in the technical development of its products. So post-war, both 16mm and 8mm had improved, whilst 9.5 hadn't. And in fact, many enthusiasts of 9.5 rate the quality of pre-war 9.5 prints in terms of the image quality and the sound quality over post-war film prints. So the hindrances of the war and post-war austerity impacted the continuation and the development of 9.5 products, and as such, it was slow to start up production again, and also rather inconsistent. And also, like I said, the quality had shifted. It wasn't as good as it was pre-war. And with some bad business decisions and various attempts to kind of keep it going, in 1960, the professional manufacturing of 9.5 ceased. However, many enthusiasts for the gauge, amateur filmmakers and collectors alike, were not going to let it go so easily. Group 9.5 was founded in the early 1960s by Larry Pearce and Paul Van Summeren here in the UK, with the idea that they would still source and sell 9.5 film stock and equipment, as well as print professional films for collectors. They did less of the latter, really, but they bought the 9.5 printing and processing equipment from Pathoscope in London and set up shop. Novascope was another initiative which a bit later attempted printing copies of beloved films for collectors. And while Group 9.5 endured, Novascope was less successful in its endeavours. Bear in mind that these were all enthusiasts doing this with their own money and in their spare time, most likely whilst working full-time jobs and having families as well. However, the collecting of 9.5 film and equipment, as well as filmmaking on 9.5, has amazingly kind of managed to keep going in stops and starts, both within the UK and places in Europe to this day. Getting hold of film stock and actually printing and processing it is quite difficult, and it is getting harder, I think, over the years. Like I said, there have been various attempts to sort of revive it, but I think it's quite impressive, given that 9.5 ceased professional production 65 years ago. Group 9.5 is still going. There have been other groups too. Some have ceased doing things. Others are still getting on with it. And then websites. There's some great websites that have come out as well. So Graham Newnham's web pages, which is in yellow there on the slide, and also Martin Stevens' Synodistan, which, in spite of the sad passing of both of them in recent years, these websites have actually been kept going by Dino Everett at the University of Southern California. So really grateful shout out to Dino, because he's picked up the work on these, and there's a wealth of knowledge on these sites about equipment and amateur film gauges and their history that would actually otherwise be lost, as well as in the Group 9.5 magazine and other areas. I just want to highlight a couple of publications. These are, again, all kind of publications that have been done by enthusiasts, people who love the gauge. The 9.5 Vintage Film Encyclopedia is the Bible of 9.5 film, which was researched and put together over many years by Garth Pedler and David Wyatt, with contributions from many other people I know. And it was compiled and recently revised by Patrick Moles. There are also several rare but incredibly useful books by collector Gerald McKee, which I've included on the slide. And there are lots of others as well, or a good few others that are really interesting. I just don't have the time to include here. But as I said, it's just really impressive that it's still going in some form or another as a format, and the history of it is being kept alive. And I'm really hopeful that this will continue with those of us that are now picking up the baton, that this history will be preserved and 9.5 will carry on well into the future, even though it's no longer in professional production. Thank you very much. Just got thanks at the end there, and just a few resources in case anyone's interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. That was brilliant. I'm hoping you can all hear me and see me. Just really enjoyed that. I noticed that the Pathoscope gem had a beautiful streamlined silhouette, which was very reminiscent of the 1930s, and I really appreciated that. I'm sure lots of participants on this webinar did too. But how many of these machines were actually sold, and were there clubs for enthusiasts?
I mean, I don't know off the top of my head how many of the machines sold. I think it would have been a lot, and I think it probably varied from projector to projector, just
of course, yeah.
Because I mean, one of the problems Pathé had was there was very little standardization of 9.5, so you needed different projectors for different things. Some projectors were better than others, so I think some sold better than others, and some didn't continue for very long. I think the Lux, which I included there, I think the Lux didn't actually do very well, and they didn't make that many of them.
Okay.
So sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Were there any clubs
clubs.
In film enthusiasts? I know there were magazines, because you mentioned those.
Yeah, actually, I should have included that. Yeah, there were lots of amateur film clubs. I should have included something about that, so I apologise actually. But
no, not at all.
But yeah, no, there were, amateur filmmaking and home movie groups were, a very big thing. And yeah, there were lots of them, and they sort of, I mean, they were a lot of them I think were mostly around filmmaking, but you did get groups that mixed that with also viewing home movie viewing, but viewing of other films as well. And some of them were more geared towards film viewing than they were towards filmmaking, but generally I think they did a mix of both, really. But yeah, it was a big thing, particularly regionally, I think, in this country, definitely.
Okay. I have a question from Rita, who says, when did you start collecting and how much do you have?
Oh gosh. I actually started collecting relatively recently. This sort of the 9.5 thing kind of came out of my last job at the BFI, where it actually started. It had more to do with film collectors at the time. I was given a collection of 16mm film that had been donated from a collector's son after he'd passed away, and so I got into researching the collection and researching collectors, and I sort of discovered that a lot of them had started on 9.5mm film as children. So I then sort of went into discovering more about 9.5. So that was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. So I've probably only been actually collecting for maybe 3 or 4 years. But I've jumped right in at the deep end. And the collecting community I found really, really nice. Like, they're really helpful, and I think they really want to hand down the kind of information and the passion and stuff. And in terms of size, I think I have approximately about 150 films, which sounds a lot, but 9.5 comes on, you know, small cassettes or small reels. And I have 22 projectors at the minute. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Thank you. There's another question from Toby. He says, this is quite interesting, actually. 9.5 millimeters, obviously it's millimeters as it's a French company, but did the British embrace it in millimeters, or did they want to try and convert it to inches?
No, a millimeter seems to be the standard way it's always been measured. It was across the board for film. So yeah, I think that was the same, you know, wherever. I mean, I think in America again, I mean, Kodak, who kind of, like I said, produced kind of 16 millimeter and 8 millimeter, it was all, everything's just been measured in millimeters rather than inches, which is interesting because when you get to videotape, that is measured in inches, which I don't know where that's come from, but it hasn't been it hasn't been dependent on the country for some reason, but everything's millimeters. Not sure why.
Yeah, it's just one of those random things.
Yeah.
Emma asks, are there any websites where we can view any of these films?
So
maybe on the BFI website?
We wouldn't really have anything specific. There probably are some 9.5 films, but you wouldn't necessarily know they were 9.5. It's more about the content. I would suggest, so Graham Newnham, who I mentioned his website, which is pathefilm.uk, he has a YouTube channel which I think is also being maintained, and there's a number of 9.5 films on there that he's uploaded. I mean, I'd probably suggest going to Google mostly for looking at them. There's nothing specifically dedicated to 9.5 off the top of my head. There's probably something glaringly obvious that I haven't thought about.
Yeah, no, don't worry. Another question from Richard. He says, well, it's not so much a question, but a comment. He says, I have some 9.5 millimeter films my dad made. He was a professional filmmaker at the BBC. One was a drama with the sound on disc. I have the film, but not the sound discs. And then he's asking me to share your contact email, Rosie. So, because he'd like you to have the films.
Oh, well.
How lovely.
That's very nice. I mean, I suppose if I'm going to be professional about it, I'd probably suggest, for me, if it was coming to me personally, I think they'd probably be better preserved as in an archive. But I'm happy to have a conversation with him and talk that through, definitely. Because I mean, I keep my films, I'll be honest, you know, as I can't afford professional storage for my own personal collection. I keep mine in a unit, which is fine. But I'm always, I think, as an archivist, kind of concerned for, you know, the longer term preservation of these things. I'm super interested, and I'd love to talk to you more about
Richard, would you like to share your email address, and we can work this out between you and Rosie?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Got quite a few comments. Dominique says, thank you for promoting the gauge. Can you tell us about the gauge, Rosie? Whoops, sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So what is the gauge?
So the gauge just refers to, so you get different gauges of film. That's the size. So 9.5 millimeter is a gauge. It's, you know, gauging the size, I guess.
I see. Okay. Brilliant. Okay, right. David says, I did find some YouTube videos of the 9.5 films worth people having a look. So, okay, that seems to suggest that YouTube is a good resource for being able to watch some of these movies, or home movies. And Dominique now says there's a real 9.5 show in London this Saturday at Croxley. Okay,
Yes,
Croxley
actually,
Green Methodist Church, New Road, Croxley Green, Rickmansworth, on Saturday at 6:30, and entrance is free. Okay.
yeah, I think that is actually put on by Group 95 as well, and
Ah,
it's a sound show, so it should be good. I
okay.
unfortunately can't make it. I was hoping to go, but I can't make it. But yes, I would highly recommend people go. It's, they're a nice group, really nice group.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so there's a thriving community to this day, Group 95, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of getting smaller. I would say. I think the people who are the last sort of generation that grew up with 9/5,
Yeah,
are sort of much older now. But
yeah.
yeah, there's still a lot of enthusiasm for it. So
Okay,
it's nice.
okay, all right. Um, all right. Thank you, Richard, also for sharing your email address. We'll do that behind the scenes with Rosie. And I think we've come to the end. But thank you, Rosie, for a completely fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Lots of interesting questions and comments, which is a sure sign that our members have really enjoyed the webinar. Okay, so everyone, if you'd like to rewatch this, you'll be sent a link, a YouTube link within a few days, and a feedback form. So please complete the feedback form, because we love to hear your constructive criticism, but also it means you'll be entered into the draw to win a free ticket for next month's webinar, which will be an architectural talk about Celia Paget in the 1930s by Peter Forsyth. This will take place on Tuesday, the 10th of June at 7 o'clock in the evening. So please book your ticket ASAP. So just remains, hold on, let me just double check. Okay, Richard says, thanks so much, a great talk and wonderful Art Deco Society. Okay, thank you, Richard. And thank you, Rosie. So I think that's it. We'll sign off now, and thank you so much.
No,
Hope you
thank
enjoyed
you.
it. Good night.